Diary of a Country Priest, Bresson, Winterlight, Bergman, Ordet, Dreyer, Mirror, Tarkovsky. And I thought, I'm going to play with these references. Now, these are all kind of slow films. So I said, I'm going to make a slow film. And then it turned out I didn't make a slow film. And when I was in the editing room, the editor turned to me and he said, there's a lot of Taxi Driver in this film. He said, yeah, I know there's some because I put it in there. He said, no, there's not some. There is a lot. And what had happened was I was using these intellectual art cinema models, but I was gluing them together with the obsession that 40 years ago caused me to write Taxi Driver. And so it was that weird thing of having this spiritual template and this vulgar, obsessive, angry voice from Charles Bickle, and somehow they came together. And I had not really planned or anticipated that. I thought the film was going to be much slower than it is. But once I got in the trenches, I just kept reverting to what I knew best, which was how I had begun my career, which was Taxi Driver, the first script I wrote.
And I caught a Q&A with you where you said that when writing this film, you would constantly ask yourself, what would Tarkovsky do? And that then led to the dream sequence.
No, not constantly.
Okay.
I knew at the end of this film, I had to jump into the non-material world, into the magical world, until that world that is so close to us. We can almost sometimes touch it, but we never can. But it's running right next to us, the world of the spirit. So now I've got to go there at the end. But I think I need to tell the audience that this world exists, and that don't be surprised if we go there. So I said, how can I foreshadow that? How can I tell them there is a non-material world coexisting with this one? Mm-hmm. And that's when I literally said to myself, what would Tarkovsky do? And I said, well, Tarkovsky would have them levitate. That was his go-to position. You get two people horizontal and they're going to start moving on up. And I said, yes, that's what I'll do. I'll have them levitate. Now, but when Tarkovsky had them levitate, it was usually strictly in an Edenic situation. But I said to myself, this man's mind is so polluted and so angry with despair that he will destroy even this Edenic, transcendental, levitational moment. He will take the first panel of Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, the Eden panel, and he will go right through the present until he hits the last panel, which is the panel of torment, because that's what he's going to do to this moment. He's going to destroy it with his poisoned even mind. And that's what he does. And it's at that point, the film, there's nowhere else to go but on this path of suicidal glory.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to open it up to audience questions. Yeah.
Mr. Schrader, this is my fourth time seeing it, so thanks a lot. It's not often that you get a chance to talk to an artist about a masterpiece that they've made, so thank you very much. One of the things that for me is best about the film is how tightly packed, just as we were saying. And if we go in the scene from Millie's Diner, and that one cuts directly into the cycling, I wonder if that's something, so we're going from Bulk, whom you show so well as what a lot of us in this room would see as the worst thing in America, and then you cut right into the cycle with the close-up on the spokes of the wheel, and you also have Ethan talking about, it's been 20 years since I was on my bike. Now I wonder, is that a cut that you had already made, or that transition that you wrote initially, or did it come later?
I know I planned that. The bicycling is a lift from Diary of a Country Priest. In Diary of a Country Priest, the young priest, Claude Ledoux, has one moment of exterior liberation. He's on his way to the village, and a kid he knows has a motor scooter and offers him a ride. And he sits on the back of this motor scooter, and he is exhilarated. Never ridden in a motor scooter before. And you can see his face sort of exhilarated that this is what life can do. Life can offer you these kinds of thrills. Of course, he goes on, to reject them. And I said, I need to do the equivalent in this film. And so that's where the idea of the cycling scene came, which is just a moment of enjoyment of the physical world, the pleasures of being in your body, being in nature, and his joy of understanding that, which then makes everything else more poignant. And so, yes, the structure of the film is it's exactly the structure of the script.
And just a quick follow-up, when you hone in on the spokes of the bicycle, were you having an active support of a machine that does not pollute the world, of something that we've created that is healthy?
Well, no, that has to do with this notion of transcendental style, this notion of dislocation and unease when you look at things too closely. So you're never looking at things too closely. You're laid back, you're using planimetric composition, center punching, you're using all these devices, and then all of a sudden, boom, you go in close. And it's meant to create a sense of unease more than anything else. It's not an intellectual choice, it's a kind of emotional choice that makes you feel strange. Why all of a sudden am I seeing these spokes so closely? And so you're playing that game with the viewer.
This may or may not be.
Because out of that unease comes a willingness to jump. The more the audience is uneasy, the more they are discomforted but mesmerized, the more willing they are to take a leap forward into a place they haven't been to. And so you have to manipulate their unease with an ulterior target. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. This may or may not be connected to that idea, but was that part of the reason behind the square format?
Now, the square format. Originally that became because I had the idea to do this film after I had dinner with Pavel Pavlovsky, who had done Ida. And we were talking about his film, the Polish film. He had read my book, and I had loved his film, and we talked about the new economics of cinema and spiritual cinema. And I walked uptown that night. I said, okay, it's time now. You're going to be 70 next year. It's time to write that movie you swore you would never write. It's time to write a spiritual movie. And what Pavel had done in Ida was square format, black and white. Said, okay, so it's time for me. I'm going to make a movie like that. And so that's where the idea came from. I had a delivery requirement that blocked the black and white. But I was able to hold onto the format. But what's nice about that format, it's a kind of withholding device. It gives you less. It tells you immediately as a viewer, this is not the same as a normal movie. There's less. We're going to show you less. And one of the amazing things, the beautiful things that happens in that format is you don't need overs. Now, over the shoulders are one of the building blocks of narrative storytelling. But in the old days, in the silent movie days, there weren't that many overs because they had the square format. You didn't need overs. The moment the format went horizontal, you had a big head here, and they didn't want to put it in the center, so they put it off to the right or left. And then you had a hole. What do you do with a hole? Well, you put somebody's shoulder in it, you put somebody's ear in it, the side of their head. Now you have an over the shoulder. Now, virtually everything you see in narrative TV today is based on over the shoulders. One after another after another. It's our lingua franca. Well, when you're in a format, a square, you don't really need over the shoulders anymore. You can just shoot straight, loose singles, cutting below the breastbone, and not connect the people in space, because it creates a priority between the person in the foreground, the person in the background, and the focus shift, and you understand as a viewer that there is a dynamic priority relationship between the foreground and the background. Without that, you just have a plain iconographic image. And this is unsettling in a way to people who are so used to seeing overs. Now, I don't think anyone in this audience turned to the person next to them and said, "Oh my God, there are no overs in this film." But something inside you said, "There's something not quite right here." There's there's part of the film language that isn't being used. Why am I never seeing that shot with both characters in it, from behind? And that creates unease. Even if you don't intellectually or emotionally identify the unease, it does create an unease. And it's out of this unease that you can start to work your evil magic.
Yeah.
I'm just curious why you chose a suicide vest as the weapon that the husband was going to use originally, as opposed to any other weapon. I guess, more specifically, like a gun.
I've done guns before, and a gun didn't feel right for this type of death, because a gun begins as an aggression toward others, whereas the vest begins as an aggression toward yourself, which you then spread to others. And so I just thought it was a much more potent metaphor for this guy. One of the first scripts I wrote, Yakuza, a character is describing the East versus the West. And he said, in the West, a man goes crazy, opens the window and kills somebody else. In the East, a man goes crazy, he closes the window and kills himself. And so, that's a kind of fundamental difference between how these neurotic pathologies evidence themselves. And I think he's, much more comfortable. Now, this brings me to another interesting subject. Is he, in fact, a radical ecologist? Or is it something he caught? It's a virus he caught from this boy. He's on a kind of death trip. One year I'm going to write a diary. Well, what's going to happen after the end of a year? Well, something's going to happen. It doesn't seem to be very good. But St. Augustine told us that suicide is a sin. Suicide is a sin of pride and the sin against God. But there's one exception to that. Samson. Samson was not a suicide, Samson was a martyr. And when he brought the temple down on top of himself, he glorified God and got, the express elevator to heaven. And so we have this clergyman who is in the throes of this suicidal pathology, this crazy notion that my suffering can equal the Lord's, and therefore I can earn my own way into heaven because I can suffer as much as he can, which is certainly not what Jesus taught, which is certainly a pathology, and it's the same pathology in Islam and jihadism. But of course he knows this is a sin. And then this boy comes into his life and kills himself, and there on the ground is the mantle of martyrdom. The boy has said to them, "Do you believe in martyrs?" And all of a sudden, all of his selfish, prideful, suicidal pathology is now wrapped in the cloak of martyrdom and is justified as a cleansing act for the planet. Well, that's what he's bought into. It's evil, you know, but it is an understandable pathology, because when Christians go off the rails, they usually go off in this way, which is they confuse Christ sacrificing for them with their own sacrificing, and it says, you know, Cedric says to him, Jesus does not want our suffering. He suffered for us, but it's too late for Reverend Toller to hear this, because he now is committed to his own suffering. So, yeah.
To follow on that, so when Ethan declares that Michael's standing on holy ground when he died, that could only come that far along in the story, right?
Yeah, I mean, that to me is like one of the spookiest lines in the film. That story that Ethan tells about his grandfather is actually a story about my grandfather. This is part of my family mythology. My grandfather was a celery farmer in Muskegon, Michigan, and he died in exactly this fashion. Took his boys to the bank, died in the elevator, and said, "Take off my shoes, I'm standing on holy ground," which is a quote from Moses. And I gave Toller that speech just to show how far gone he was. He's talking about a kid who blows his head off in a suicide. And he's saying about this kid, he stands on holy ground. Well, that is clearly outside the theological pale. When he's gotten himself to a position where he's saying that this boy who shot his head off is a saint, well, he is, you know, nothing good is going to happen now. And then he starts quoting Revelations, and then you know he's done for.
Yeah, in the back.
This is more of a personal question of somebody coming from a similar background. When you first got to experience film finally, and you entered into an environment like Calvin College, did you feel that do you remember like a certain moment where you experienced like a crisis of faith, and that you needed to reconcile that in order to follow your passion for film?
Well, I mean, a lot of it had to do with the 60s. So everything was up for grabs. And I think the actual turning point was about 1966. When I graduated from Michigan, I was at Calvin. And there was a little softcore porn theater near the college, the Russ Meyer kind of films. And he was going out of business, the owner. And he decided, in a stroke of genius, to have a 3-week Ingmar Bergman festival. And so he showed all, you know, Through a Glass Darkly, Seven Seals, Wild Strawberries, he showed all of them. And the kids from the college started going. And this was our first taste of intellectual European, theologically oriented cinema. And we were watching these films and we were saying, wait a second, Bergman is dealing with the very same issues we're dealing with in our classes, in our chapel, and our exercises. There's no divide between secular commercial cinema and religious studies. They are the same. And Bergman is reaching across. And that was the moment where he suddenly realized, aha, these are not totally separate worlds. There is a bridge between the art of the movies and the theological training I'm going through. And so that's where it happened. And then, of course, magnified by the events of 66, 67, 68, and then, and it was like a howl wind had come in and taken us away.
Yeah, in the back.
I'm curious about the ending of the movie for you. Like, did you want the viewer to have any sort of interpretation of that? And, after, what in your mind happens since you wrote it?
There were three possible endings. One, which I rejected off the top, was the Peckinpah ending, which was the carnage, or the Zabriskie point. And I thought, no, I don't think that is where I should go with this. So then I went to the next one I thought of, which is the country priest ending, which is where the priest is dying, he falls off screen, dies off screen, and we're left with the vision of the crucifix on the wall. And that was the first version I wrote. And Ken Jones, who's a friend of mine who now runs the New York Film Festival, I gave him the script and I said, Ken, what do you think of that? And he said, you went for the country priest ending. I thought you were going to go for the hors d'oeuvre ending. And as soon as he said that, boom, I realized, oh, fuck, he's right. Hors d'oeuvre is a movie, 1954, by Carl Dreyer, about it's a Danish movie. And there's a man, his wife dies in childbirth, and he has a crazy brother who thinks he's Jesus Christ. And the brother has been lost and presumed dead. And then at the funeral, his brother shows up. And his brother walks in and he says, I have come back to raise your wife from the dead because I am Jesus Christ. And he starts yelling at his brother, you ruined everything, you get out of here. And then his daughter says, Daddy, why don't you let him try? And okay, so then he lets the brother try, and the brother raises her from the dead. She rises from the coffin. And his response to seeing this miracle is not to fall on his knees and say, thank you, God, or not to say, oh my God, I'm witness to a miracle. His total response is carnal. Let me get my hands on her. She was dead, she's alive again. I can kiss her, I can hold her, I can squeeze her. Kiss, 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 hold, hold, hold. And that's all he can think about. And I thought, that's the ending for this movie. The carnal response to divine intervention. Not, this is holy, but this is heaven. Carnality. And I thought, Toller is standing there with the cup from Gethsemane. And he drinks it, and he falls on hands and knees, and he's purging out his insides. And God, who has refused to talk to him, now walks over to him and says, Reverend Toller, do you want to know what heaven looks like? I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to pull back the curtains. This is what heaven looked like. It looks like one long kiss. And that's the last thing he sees.
So good. Okay, we have time for one last question. Yeah.
When Ethan is talking to Michael when he goes to visit him at home, and Michael asks him, when he's explaining how he can go on after the loss of his son and his wife, and he gives the answer about courage and it having nothing to do with all the evidence that's there that would also just indicate what else is there to live for, and also courage and hope, and it not necessarily having anything to do with what, in terms of religion or like religious dogma. Or like
Well,
that.
her question is about this discussion between Toller and Michael and about how do you go on?
Yeah.
And, the answer is courage. You need the courage to hold hope and despair simultaneously. We now live in a time where there is relatively little reason for hope. So the question becomes, do you just give up? Or do you hope because hope itself makes life livable? As Albert Camus said, I don't believe, I choose to believe. So should we now say, I don't hope, I choose to hope? And that's what Toller says, we must choose to hope in the face of all evidence otherwise, because life is not tenable if we don't make that choice. And this is something we are now living in. You much more than me, and your children much more than you. This notion that we are playing out a doom scenario. And how does one live with that permanent dark cloud over oneself? And that even if Donald Trump were, God willing, to die tonight, that black cloud would still be over all of us. Trump in some way is a reflection of that darkness, not the cause of that darkness.
That was like one of the best lines ever. And all of a sudden I was like, that's it. And I was like, somebody finally said it. And I was like, see? And I was like, it's hope and love. And I was like, that's the thing.
Yeah.
That was like one of the best
Thank you
things
so
ever.
much for making this movie, and thank you so much for being here.